Well, good evening, everyone. This evening we're going to talk a little bit about perhaps the most famous race pilot and one of the most famous pilots. In fact, he was famous for being famous. And his name, obviously, is Roscoe Turner. Roscoe was born in Corinth, Mississippi in 1895. He only had a 10th grade education. In this 1916, he wanted to be a pilot, but he lacked a college education. But he was very mechanical. He got involved in automobiles. He was a mechanic, bus driver, truck driver, worked on Cadillacs and Packards, so he gained a lot of knowledge. In April of 17, he joined the Army. Wanted to be a pilot, but again, he didn't have that kind of education. So he volunteered as an ambulance driver and was promised to go immediately to France. Well, knowing the Army, they broke their promise. So they sent him to school. Took his basic training and then on to school, and they said, well, you want pilot training, we'll train you to be a balloon pilot. Well, he settled for that. Spent a lot of time here in this country, and part of the training in becoming a balloon pilot, you must make at least one parachute jump. Because as a balloon observer or a balloon pilot, you have no defense against an enemy aircraft. Your only defense is to bail out. So he didn't mind the parachuting. And he rose to the rank of sergeant first class while here. And then he went to France and became a balloon pilot. Got certified as a balloon pilot. And then the war ended. He never saw action, actually. But he volunteered to stay in Germany in the Army of Occupation. And the only official or unofficial words I found was he took unofficial flight training while in Germany. In other words, his buddies taught him to fly, and the colonel looked the other way while he was flying. So he left the Army as a first lieutenant in September of 1919. So what did he do when he come back? He got the bug, wanted to fly, and barnstorming became pretty popular. So he met with another fella, Harry Runser, and he became a wing walker and a parachute jumper, while still working in a garage and having a repair shop. They inadvertently purchased an illegal surplus military aircraft. Somebody offered a Jenny for sale. It was appealing. They bought it, and they found out the guy selling it didn't own it. It was still owned by the government. So their lawyer recommended they plead guilty, and they did, and they were sent to prison. Well, they finally found out the truth, and they were pardoned, and actually pardoned by President Calvin Coolidge. In 23, Turner was operating a successful automobile repair business in Corinth and barnstorming with his wing walker and stuntman and parachutist. On his birthday in 1924, he married Caroline Hunter Stovall on the farm near Corinth where he kept his aircraft. Now, they were in the cockpit, and the preacher was trying to balance himself on the wing without falling off, pronounced a man and wife. And they took off and flew out of there on their honeymoon, and you'll never guess where they went. They went to Dayton, Ohio, because that's where the air races were. Now, he wanted to start an airline, and he found that this, in 25, he secured the only 16-passenger Sikorsky aircraft. And he started Roscoe Turner Airways Incorporating, and wanting to have an airline, but he used it for charters, publicity campaigns, and passenger joyrides. And in 28, it was leased to the Cardio Productions, who was actually Howard Hughes. And it was modified to represent the German Gotha bomber in the movie Hell's Angels. Well, he had a contract with Howard Hughes, and Howard Hughes demanded that he do a full power tailspin. Well, he tried a low power tailspin, and he said the airplane won't hold together, and so he refused to do it. So Howard Hughes broke the contract, found another pilot who said he would do it. He took off with a mechanic and went to several thousand feet and nosed it over into a tailspin and realized the airplane was going to come apart. So he bailed out, never told the mechanic, so the mechanic was killed in a crash, and they were thinking about actually prosecuting him for murder. So Roscoe had some association not only with Howard Hughes, but he did actually get involved with a number of films. 1927, he moved to Richmond, Virginia. He purchased a piece of land, a pasture. He leveled 2 runways and called it Richmond Air Junction. He established a flight school, passenger service, and an aerial photography business. He then became the local distributor for Waco Aircraft, a high-quality sport biplane of the time. But here again, it was not successful, so another failure. Now in 29, he was approached by the Roscoe Parachute Company, who had developed a 60-foot parachute designed to lower a complete aircraft safely to the ground when the engine was disabled. Well, Roscoe took the single-engine Thunderbird aircraft to 5,000 feet, shut the engine down, and released the parachute. The aircraft floated down and landed in a farm pasture. The landing gear and the propeller were damaged by the hard landing, but Roscoe was not injured. The drop took about 5 minutes, and it was witnessed by the press and newsreel cameras and other aircraft. And I did see this video of the airplane. I thought I had it, but I was going to use it, but I couldn't find it. But obviously, it was a feature of, it became a feature of some aircraft that are produced today. 1929, another attempt on an airline. He attempted to create a fast service airline from LA to Reno and Las Vegas. He acquired 4 Lockheed Vegas and formed Nevada Airlines. Roscoe was the chief pilot, and he had his aircraft christened the Alimony Special because the Hollywood people were going back and forth, getting married and getting divorced and getting married and getting divorced. But here again, it never came to real fruition. However, in 29, he took one of those Vegas and entered the Thompson Trophy race. Believe it or not, he came in 3rd place because that was the year that the Travel Air Mystery Ship blew the Army Boeing, which was supposed to win away, and he came in 3rd, and he beat the Navy's pursuit ship. He found a sponsor. He wanted to really promote flying and set records, so he found Earl Gilmore, who was the president and owner of the Gilmore Oil Company, talked him into buying this Lockheed Air Express. Well, the Gilmore Oil Company logo was a lion head. Roscoe got the idea, why not have a lion as a pet? Now, in some of the reading I've done, I've learned that this came from really World War I, where the Lafayette Escadrille guys had lions for a pet. So it was really nothing new. But here again, he never had a whole lot of money. So he went to this lion farm, and they wanted $1,000 for a lion. And he convinced the owner of giving him some real publicity if he'd give him a cub. So he got a 3 or 4 week old cub. Obviously, it's a little larger here. And here you see Roscoe and Carline and Gilmore, the lion. He was pretty small when he got him, and he took him everywhere. And they told him you could never tame a lion like that, and he didn't agree. And he was right. He did. He was able to tame him. So that lion kept getting bigger and bigger, and one day the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals approached him and said, flying that lion around, you got a parachute, the engine quits, you're in good shape. What about that poor lion? He said, well, I guess we'll have to deal with that. So he went to the Irving Parachute Company, and they fabricated a parachute for Gilmore. And of course he kept growing and growing. And here it shows you how tame the animal really was. I talked to, or at least read, where here in Cleveland, Bob Hull, who wrote the book on air racing here, had interviewed the bell captain at the Hotel Carter, and he said, you know, the night before the races, they're all sitting around in a big lobby drinking, and there was Gilmore in the midst of them. I like this picture. I mean, you show the confidence he had in that animal, and look at the smile on the animal's face. And he would take them just about everywhere. You see people standing off and obviously concerned, but he got pretty big. Well, he got so big he couldn't carry him in the airplane anymore, so he had to truck him around. So he had a truck built with a big cage to haul him around. He even used him in his Christmas card in 1932, his Carline sitting on Gilmore, and Roscoe with the whip, which was another ploy. He wanted to really do something in air racing, so he went to Waddell Williams in Louisiana and told him he had an idea for building a race plane. Gave him the idea, told him what he wanted, built the airplane. Test fluid and a wing came off. And fortunately, Jimmy Waddell was able to get out, parachute. So he said, okay, we'll build you another one, but this time Roscoe sent Don Young, his trusted mechanic, down there to make sure they did a good job. They had a reputation for doing some pretty poor welding, which wound up in another accident. And this is what they came up with when he finally decided that it was what he wanted. And he flew it in 32 here in the race and came in third in the Thompson Trophy. Very attractive looking airplane. In 33, the air races were in California. I show you some of these pictures because he had more sponsors than I could keep track of. This was Rigfield Oil, McKillen Oil 32, which was in Los Angeles. Now he flew the race, and Jimmy Waddell was impressed with the airplane that Roscoe had designed, so he decided to build a couple for himself. This is number 44 that he raced, and number 92 that was used by other race pilots. Now, in 33 in Los Angeles, Turner actually won at 214 miles an hour, but he cut inside of a pylon on number 2. To avoid a collision, he didn't recircle it until next to the last lap, but regained the lead and won. But the judge came and said you had to recircle the pylon you missed, not later, but then. So the trophy was awarded to Jimmy Waddell, who was in second place. In 1933, Roscoe was awarded the Harmon Trophy for the first time. This is excelling in contributions to aviation. Set a couple of speed records in 30, Los Angeles to New York City, 32 and 34. One of the refueling stops, and notice how the gentleman holding the oil can there, as you can prominently read the name of the oil on there. 34, he came up with this Hornet-powered engine for that aircraft. Now, he and people at Pratt & Whitney were really close. He had a lot of good friends at Pratt & Whitney. Now, you know, these guys didn't own those engines. Those engines were on loan from the engine manufacturer. So he won the first Thompson Trophy at 248 in 1934. And in 29, he had purchased this brand new Packard touring car, and not only for himself, but Don Young drove the Packard around the country while Roscoe flew the airplane. So that's how Don Young got around. Here he's showing off a couple of his trophies. Went on the radio in a program called Sky Blazers. He was promoting Heinz rice flakes, not ketchup, not mustard, not relish, rice flakes. It was a kids program. There again, that fancy uniform, that blue tunic and the jodhpurs that he wore and the boots. So here he's receiving the Thompson Trophy, and I never did find out what happened to his helmet. He was having a bad hair day that day. I don't know if he rubbed it up against the top of the cockpit and it tore or what, but never found out about that. Now that was in September, Labor Day weekend. Now in October, he entered the McRobertson Air Race of 1934. This was a race from London, England to Melbourne, Australia. Melbourne, Australia was celebrating their centenary or their 100th anniversary, and they proposed an air race to try to convince people you could get from England to Australia in 3 days or less, because they were hurting for people. You know, Australia is not only a country, it's also a continent. That's how big it is, and they were hurting for people. And there was a large trophy and a large amount of money. It was, of course, in pounds sterling, but in equivalent, it was $75,000, and it was really a gold trophy. So that was an appeal. Now, what are you going to fly in a race like that? We're looking at 11,300 miles, crossing 19 countries and 7 seas. What a challenge. And there were 2 divisions, the speed and the handicap. The speed, the winner, first one across the finish line was the winner, and the handicap division, they had to wait until all the aircraft that entered got there, because there were a lot of a monocoupe, a couple of open cockpit biplanes, and that type of thing. So it was a real challenge. So he went to talk to his friends at Pratt & Whitney, and Pratt & Whitney talked to their friends at United Airlines, and Boeing was producing these 247s, and he talked them, United, into leasing a brand new 247 to fly in the race. Here's a show at Mendenhall when he arrived, and you can see there, you can't see through the windows. Well, that's because of the gas tanks, which I'll show you. Now, he needed a co-pilot and a radio operator. Clyde Pangborn on the left there was his co-pilot. Pangborn was the one that flew from Tokyo to Seattle and set a record, so he had some experience. And radios weren't really that good at that point in time, so he conned Reeder Nichols, who was a lieutenant in the Navy and a radio specialist. And Reeder Nichols built the radio. And here again, Roscoe and all his promotions, one of the functions of the radio was to broadcast from wherever they were to the state of Washington, where there was a receiver for them, and that information would go to the news media. So he's always looking for sponsors, and did an excellent job of finding them. Now, this is what the cabin looked like inside. It was full of fuel tanks. Now, he picked up the airplane at Seattle and flew it to New York to be put on a ship to take it over. And he took with him his wife and his secretary. Now, I don't know where they sat, but somewhere in there. Well, halfway across the country, He said to Pangborn, he says, go back and check on the gals and see how they're doing it. And they were both zonked out. So I guess he woke them up, and here carbon monoxide was getting inside the cabin, and they were going under. So they were able to open some cabin windows and get them some fresh air, and they were not injured. Well, long and short, it's a long story, and do a lecture just on this. England built 3-purpose aircraft, de Havilland Comets, for that race. And one of them, which was sponsored by a hotel in London, was Grosvenor House, won the race, first one over the finish line. Well, the second one over the finish line was this Dutch KLM DC-2. Now, Roscoe was third. However, the Dutch decided not to accept the second place of the speed division rather than accept the first place of the handicap division, which moved Roscoe up in the second place. One woman and 2 men, bankers. The woman was a German pilot on her right, and the 2 Dutch bankers. When the race was over, they flew back to Holland, and the crew was knighted. They became knights, and the passengers received gold medals. Now, Roscoe didn't even get as much as a telegram from President Roosevelt. However, he soon made the cover of Life, or Time magazine. 1935, we're dealing with Bendix Trophy race and the Thompson Trophy race. Benny Howard built this cabin plane as a racer. His intention was to produce them as executive aircraft, so it was pretty fast. So he entered that aircraft in the cross-country Bendix race, and Roscoe entered his Weddell with the big Hornet engine. Well, Benny won. Benny beat Roscoe by 26 seconds across the country. And he just loved to rub it in. As soon as he landed, they didn't land at the same time because they took off at different times. He was there with the cameras, chiding Roscoe. And he told them this story, that they had landed in, I think, Indianapolis for fuel, and that aircraft had flaps. So he put the flaps down for the landing, and he was in such a hurry, he took off, he never raised the flaps. So he flew that whole leg into Cleveland with the flaps down, and he kept saying, Roscoe, I beat you with the brakes on. Now, that same year, Roscoe entered that aircraft into the Thompson Trophy race. And I don't know, the 6th or 7th lap, as he was approaching the home pylon or the airport, the engine blew. His first thought was to bail out. And he looked down at those thousands and thousands of people and said, I can't do this. So he opted to dead stick it. Here again, he saw the video of that, and I can't tell you how many times that airplane bounced. It came in at full speed. So Harold Newman won in Mr. Mulligan. And he kept telling Roscoe how sorry he was. He had such bad luck. And he says, don't talk about bad luck. He says, good luck is when you can walk away from a forced landing. So congratulations. And of course, some of the movie stars there. Now in 1936, because Cleveland was enlarging the airport, they had to move the grandstands. We couldn't have the air races here. So they opted to go the Bendix from New York to California. And as Roscoe was over the desert somewhere in New Mexico, he developed carburetor ice, and he had to put it down, and there was no good place to land. It was pretty rough. So he put it down, and the airplane broke in half, and he was uninjured. However, he credited that big buckle he wore on that uniform that kept the joystick from penetrating his innards. So he realized now he's going to need another airplane. This might be repairable, but he already had plans, thought about another airplane. So he started working on another airplane for 1937. So Jimmy Waddell was dead by now, so he went to the Brown Aircraft Company in California. They had built a couple racers, and he drew out, gave him the plans, the ideas, exactly what he wanted, and they built the airplane. Well, when he came to check on it, it was nearing completion. He was extremely unhappy, or almost violent, because he didn't like what the airplane looked like. He said that wing is so small that airplane will never get off the ground, and the engine's too far out. So he had a few unkind words, and he had him take the airplane apart and put it on a railroad car and transport it to Chicago, to the E.M. Laird Aircraft Company, and they made the modifications. Roscoe drew the wing he wanted, lengthened the cord, shortened the fuselage by bringing the engine back a foot and redoing the landing gear, and he was relatively happy with that and entered that in the 1937 races. He flew in the Thompson. Now, he was going to fly it in the Bendix, but as he was just before he left, the day before he left the Bendix, I think he was doing the welding and the oil tank exploded. He got somewhat burned, but they managed to repair the airplane, so he was out of the Bendix this year. And but he flew it to Cleveland and flew in the Thompson. And he was ahead, leading the race, but and at one of the turns he was blinded by the sun, and thinking he cut inside he recircled the pylon, causing him to finish third. Actually, I was with my brother at the pylon that he missed that day. Brother said, he had some words for him. He missed the pylon. So back again in 38, he handily won the Thompson Trophy race, which brought him the second trophy. And he repeated that with another sponsor in 1939. That's when he announced his retirement from air racing. He says, air racing is a young man's sport, and he was getting older. Well, this is the only picture I could really find with Don Young, his pilot, who Roscoe considered a brother. They were that close. This is taking some of the credit in winning the 39 Thompson race. And in 39, he again won the Harmon Trophy for the second time. Now, there's a lot of talk about him in that fancy uniform, that blue tunic was fashioned after RAF flight jacket, and the jodhpurs and everything. And all the things I've read, this was for showmanship. This wasn't really Roscoe. He did it because he had to. He wanted people to know who he was. So whenever he wasn't in the limelight, he wore regular civilian clothes. I like that derby hat he was wearing here. Turner was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross in 1952 by Act of Congress for his contributions to aviation development and pioneering in speed flying. It was the first to be awarded in over 20 years by Act of Congress, and only one of 6 to be awarded by Congress. One of the other persons that won the Distinguished Flying Cross was Jacqueline Cochran. Now, like so many of the other pilots, the race was over, they bugged out, went home, and left the airplanes here. So throughout the war, this airplane sat here at Cleveland Airport. And when the airport was being enlarged in, I think, early 50s, they were tearing these hangars down. So they approached gentleman over at Thompson Products, and for the price of the rent, he bought the airplane. Of course, when Roscoe found out about it, he wanted it back, but it was too late. That airplane is at the Crawford Auto Aviation Museum today, and the Laird, the Turner Laird, is at Udvar-Hazy. We almost got that plane. When I say we, I'm talking about the Crawford. There was a big to-do over there because of the Enola Gay at the Smithsonian. The then director wanted to saw just the nose off and just put the nose and not the whole aircraft. And he had a display ready to go up that literally would have said the Japanese were the good guys, we were the bad guys. And well, fortunately, he lost his job after they lost thousands of subscriptions, or hundreds perhaps, and a lot of nasty letters. So they got rid of him. So that changed the dynamics here. We didn't get the airplane. We got a few of the things before that happened, but they didn't get the Turner Laird. And his McRobertson winner, the 247D, is at the Air and Space Museum downtown Washington, D.C. Roscoe, when the war started, wanted to go back in the service, and he tried everything he could, and they said, no, you had just started this flying school, and we're going to need people like you. We want you to continue teaching people to fly. So this little operation grew to this size here, and this is Madonna, his wife, who gave the Packard. You see the Packard in the background there? Now the Smithsonian got everything but the Packard. She gave the Packard to the 500 race in Indianapolis, the Indianapolis 500 race, and it's in the basement. When I went there to lecture on it for the Indianapolis Aero Club, they allowed me to go and see it. Now I took a picture of it, but I can't find it. Now this is Madonna, his second wife. They were married, and Caroline divorced him in 41, and Madonna married him in 46. He returned here to the Cleveland races after, during the post-war era, where you see him with Cook Leland, and he's buried in a cemetery there in Indianapolis, Indiana. And that is the Roscoe Turner story. Thank you.
Where was that located?
Downtown Washington, D.C.